January 18, 1945. The pre-dawn chill of Auschwitz-Birkenau was cut only by the distant rumble of Soviet artillery, drawing ever closer. Inside the camp's crude hospital, illuminated by a single anemic bulb, Dr. Maximilian Samuel, prisoner number 173-398, had been operating for 16 grueling hours. His emaciated hands, remarkably steady, meticulously stitched the abdomen of a young Wehrmacht soldier. Around him, 3 SS medical officers watched, their expressions a grim, unsettling blend of professional awe and ideological horror. A Jew saving a German. An impossible act in an impossible place. For them, this wasn't just a surgical procedure. It was a profound betrayal of everything they believed, a gaping wound in the very fabric of Nazi doctrine. How could a system built on racial purity bend so drastically to the brutal realities of war and human need? This is the harrowing, untold story of the man whose skill tore open the fundamental contradictions of a murderous regime. Before we dive in, where are you watching us from today? Let us know in the comments below. To truly understand how such an extraordinary scene came to be, we must go back to the heart of Vienna, years before the snow fell on Auschwitz. The biting cold of January 18, 1945, clung to every surface within the Auschwitz-Birkenau hospital barrack, a pervasive chill that even the meager warmth of a single flickering bulb couldn't dispel. Outside, the heavy snow continued its silent descent, muffling the world in a deceptive blanket of white, but failing to entirely drown out the ominous rhythmic thud of Soviet artillery echoing from the distant Eastern Front. Inside, under the stark glare of that solitary lamp, Dr. Maximilian Samuel, marked forever as prisoner number 173-398, performed an emergency laparotomy. 16 hours he had been standing, his gaunt frame a testament to relentless malnutrition, yet his hands remained astonishingly steady, precise instruments of life, delicately suturing the torn abdominal cavity of a young Wehrmacht soldier. The soldier, no more than 20, lay pale and still, a casualty not of the Eastern Front but of a recent devastating train accident near Krakow, hastily transferred to the camp's improvised medical facility. Surrounding the operating table, 3 SS medical officers observed Samuel with an unsettling mixture of detached professionalism and profound, almost visible discomfort. Their faces, usually hardened by the camp's atrocities, were etched with a peculiar disquiet. They saw the seamless, elegant movements of a master surgeon, a man whose expertise undeniably surpassed their own, yet stitched onto his striped uniform, prominently displayed against his chest, was the indelible yellow star, the mark of an Untermenschen, a subhuman, an enemy of the Reich. The air in the makeshift operating theater was thick with unspoken tension, a palpable contradiction that vibrated between the prisoner's healing hands and the officer's rigid ideology. They struggled to reconcile the undeniable evidence before their eyes with the core tenets of their belief system. How could a man deemed racially inferior possess such life-saving skill? It was an ideological wound, more profound than any physical laceration, exposing a fundamental, terrifying hypocrisy at the heart of their monstrous regime. For them, Samuel was an anomaly, a living paradox, and his very presence saving an Aryan life was an affront, yet an indispensable necessity. To truly grasp the profound anomaly of this moment, to understand how a man of such exceptional caliber found himself in this abyss, his hands saving the very oppressors who sought his annihilation, one must journey back. Back through the relentless march of history, past the grim gates of Auschwitz, to a time when Vienna still sparkled with intellectual brilliance and cultural grace. In 1938, before the world descended into darkness, Dr. Maximilian Samuel was not merely a name, he was an institution. For nearly a decade, his surgical practice on the prestigious Ringstrasse had been one of Vienna's most respected, a beacon of medical excellence. Born into an affluent Jewish family, Samuel had graduated from the renowned University of Vienna in 1928, his intellect sharp, his ambition keen. He specialized in thoracic surgery, a complex and pioneering field, under the legendary tutelage of Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch, then one of Europe's foremost authorities. By his mid-30s, Samuel had become one of the rare few across Central Europe capable of performing intricate pneumonectomies, radical lung removals, with a skill that bordered on artistry. His published works, 17 articles in leading German and Austrian medical journals, were widely cited, his reputation unassailable. He was a veteran of the First World War, too, having served with distinction as a field surgeon in the Austro-Hungarian army, his bravery decorated, his patriotism unquestioned. His life was one of academic rigor, professional triumph, and domestic contentment, shared with his beloved wife and 2 young daughters in a beautiful sunlit apartment. When the Anschluss annexed Austria into the Third Reich in March of 1938, Samuel, like many, harbored a dangerous illusion. He believed, perhaps naively, that his professional eminence, his scientific contributions, and his decorated military service would shield him from the escalating persecutions targeting his people. He was a man of science, a man of healing, not politics. He was Austrian, a patriot. Surely his value was undeniable. This fragile shield of self-deception, however, proved tragically thin. It was in November of that same year, during the barbaric spree of Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, that Samuel's world, along with that of thousands of other Austrian Jews, shattered irrevocably. The guttural shouts of stormtroopers echoed through the elegant streets of Vienna, replaced by the sickening crunch of glass and the splintering of wood. Maximilian Samuel watched, powerless and horrified, as his meticulously built clinic was systematically ransacked, instruments, textbooks, medical records, all scattered, smashed, defiled. His precious operating theater, where he had saved countless lives, was reduced to a chaotic wreck. The glint of steel and the smell of fear quickly replaced the antiseptic aroma of healing. He was dragged from his home, his pleas for reason met with brutal fists and mocking laughter, his once unquestioned status evaporating into the cold night air. This was only the beginning of his descent. For the next 2 agonizing years, Samuel endured a succession of forced labor camps, each one a step deeper into the abyss of dehumanization. The sharp suits of Vienna were replaced by tattered rags, his delicate surgeon's hands calloused and raw from meaningless backbreaking labor. His identity was systematically stripped away, replaced by a growing sense of anonymity and despair. The man who had once commanded respect in lecture halls and operating rooms was now just another faceless prisoner, perpetually hungry, perpetually afraid. His once robust frame wasted away, his mind constantly battling the creeping tendrils of hopelessness. Then, in October 1942, after a brutal selection process in the Theresienstadt ghetto, Samuel's grim odyssey culminated in his transfer to Auschwitz. The journey itself was a harbinger of unspeakable horrors. Packed into cattle cars, suffocating and terrified, 200 Austrian Jews on transport number BR 1847. The air grew heavy with the stench of despair and impending death as the train lurched to a halt. The chilling scream of SS guards, the barking of dogs, the chaotic disembarkation into the bewildering, nightmarish landscape of Auschwitz. He saw the smokestacks in the distance, a dark smudge against the sky, and felt an icy dread grip his heart, a chilling premonition that whispered of an unimaginable end. The contrast with his former life, from the dignified surgeon of Vienna to a condemned prisoner in the largest extermination camp, was not merely stark. It was an obscene, brutal joke played by history. Samuel, the healer, had arrived in a place designed solely for death. Yet unbeknownst to him, a peculiar chain of events was already in motion, a grim twist of fate that would momentarily suspend the camp's merciless logic and place his gifted hands back into the service of life, even for those who sought his destruction. December 1942. The biting wind of the Polish winter howled around the barbed wire fences of Auschwitz, rattling the windows of the SS administration blocks and penetrating the flimsy walls of the prisoner barracks. Inside his stark, meticulously organized office, Dr. Eduard Wirtz, the SS chief physician, hunched over his desk. A heavy, fur-lined coat still draped over his uniform, despite the small, inefficient stove glowing sullenly in the corner. He was 38, his face usually a mask of stern, detached professionalism. But tonight, Lines of exhaustion and a barely concealed frustration marred his features. The air was thick with the scent of cheap tobacco smoke, disinfectant, and a faint, sickly sweet undertone, the persistent, grim odor of the camp. Worths, a medical doctor by training, a man who possessed what some might call strange professional scruples, even while overseeing unimaginable atrocities, found himself caught in the crushing grip of a dual crisis. A devastating typhus epidemic had swept through the camp, a relentless tide of fever, delirium, and death. It raged through the overcrowded, unsanitary prisoner barracks like wildfire, claiming hundreds of lives daily. The crematoria, already working ceaselessly, struggled to keep pace with the sheer volume of corpses. The stench of burning flesh hung perpetually in the air. Crucially, the typhus, insidious and indiscriminate, had not confined itself to the undesirables. It had breached the carefully guarded sanctity of the SS quarters, infecting guards, administrative staff, even some officers. Fear, a rare commodity in the supposedly invincible SS ranks, began to gnaw at the edges of their discipline. The camp's functionality, its very machinery of extermination and forced labor, was threatened. As Worths pored over casualty reports, his gaze lingering on the growing list of SS men hospitalized with raging fevers, another, equally dire crisis demanded his attention. The war, which once seemed an unstoppable march of triumph, was turning. Allied bombers, a persistent menace, were now targeting German industrial installations in Upper Silesia with increasing frequency and devastating accuracy. Factories vital to the war effort were being pulverized, and with each raid, a torrent of German casualties, wounded soldiers, injured civilian workers, bombed-out engineers, flowed into the regional hospitals. These facilities, already understaffed and overwhelmed by the sheer volume of war wounded from the Eastern Front, were at breaking point. Their medical resources were stretched thin, and crucially, they faced a severe shortage of skilled surgeons, particularly those capable of handling complex trauma cases. The telephone on Worth's desk, usually reserved for internal camp communications, had become a conduit for urgent, almost desperate requests from military and regional medical commands. Hospitals across the region were begging for surgical assistance. Wirths felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He was tasked not only with maintaining the health, or rather the managed illness and death of Auschwitz, but also with contributing to the broader German war effort. To fail in this duty, to be seen as incapable of solving such a critical manpower issue, would invite the wrath of his superiors. Himmler, always keen on efficiency, would not tolerate excuses. He ran a hand over his close-cropped hair, the silence of his office a stark contrast to the cacophony of illness and desperation outside. He knew what he had to do, a task that filled him with a mixture of professional exasperation and ideological disgust. He had to scour the prisoner records. Among the millions of names, the endless rows of dehumanized numbers, there had to be some skilled medical personnel. It was anathema, of course. The Untermenschen were to be eradicated, not utilized. But the pragmatic exigencies of war, and the immediate threat to his own position, demanded a temporary suspension of doctrine. Wirths pulled out thick, leather-bound ledgers, their pages filled with the meticulous, chillingly bureaucratic details of every prisoner who had passed through Auschwitz. He lit another cigarette, the smoke curling around the flickering gas lamp on his desk. Hour after hour, he pored over the cramped handwriting, his eyes scanning for keywords. Arzt, doctor, chirurg, surgeon, mediziner, medical practitioner. His frustration mounted. Most entries for doctors were for general practitioners, many elderly, broken by the camps, or already dead. Surgeons were a rarity, and specialized surgeons almost unheard of. The SS medical staff available were either mediocre, dulled by alcohol or apathy, or too junior to handle the complex cases now pouring in from the outside. Dr. Josef Mengele, with his twisted, obsessive focus on genetic experiments, was certainly no help with practical trauma surgery. Then his fingers stopped. A name, almost unremarkable amidst the endless columns of despair. Samuel Maximilian. Prisoner number 173-398. Vienna, Jewish. His eyes traced the details that followed, and a flicker of something akin to genuine surprise, quickly followed by a grimace of ideological revulsion, crossed Wirth's face. Profession, Oberarzt, senior physician, thoracic surgeon. His training, University of Vienna, 1928. Mentor, Professor Ferdinand Sauerbruch. Wirth froze, his breath catching in his throat. Sauerbruch. The name resonated with undeniable authority in medical circles across Europe. A titan of German surgery, a man whose techniques were taught in every reputable medical school. For Samuel to have studied under Sauerbruch was not merely an academic footnote, it was a stamp of exceptional quality, a rare pedigree. Wirth himself, though an SS officer, was a physician, and he knew the hierarchies of medical excellence. He remembered reading Sauerbruch's groundbreaking texts in medical school. He continued to read Samuel's file, details that seemed utterly out of place in such a ledger of the damned. Published 17 articles in German and Austrian medical journals on advanced surgical techniques. 17 articles. That wasn't just a general practitioner. That was a leading specialist. Thoracic surgery, complex pneumonectomies. This was not merely a doctor. This was a master surgeon. A profound internal battle began to rage within Wirth. Every fiber of his indoctrinated being screamed in protest. A Jew? A member of the race deemed subhuman, vermin, fit only for extermination, possessing such unparalleled skill. It was an insult to his racial ideology, a direct challenge to the very foundation of the SS's existence. The thought of bringing an Untermenschen into proximity with Aryan patients, let alone allowing him to touch them with his unclean hands, was an abomination. His mind conjured images of Himmler's furious face, of Gestapo interrogations, of accusations of racial defilement. The consequences of such a decision, if discovered and misconstrued by the hardliners, could be severe, even lethal for him. Yet, the pragmatic reality gnawed at him with an equally fierce intensity. The typhus epidemic showed no signs of abating among the SS. The reports from the regional hospitals grew more desperate with each passing day. Soldiers, valuable Aryan lives, were dying, not from enemy bullets, but from lack of competent surgical care. A dead German soldier was a far greater, more tangible failure to the Reich than the temporary, ideologically inconvenient employment of a Jewish surgeon. Wirth was a pragmatist at heart, a man who, despite his complicity in monstrous crimes, retained a cold, calculating logic when it came to efficiency and survival. He understood that the preservation of German lives, even if by unsavory means, was paramount for the war effort. He paced his cramped office, the floorboards creaking under his boots. The moral compromise he was contemplating was immense, a direct contradiction of everything he had sworn to uphold. But what was the alternative? Watch more of his men sicken and die? Allow critically wounded soldiers to succumb to treatable injuries? That would be dereliction of duty, a weakness that would not go unpunished. He envisioned the piles of casualties, the despair in the eyes of his SS staff. He saw the cold, approving gaze of his superiors if he solved the crisis, even if the method was unorthodox. He stopped at the window, peering out into the swirling snow and the eerie silence of the camp, broken only by the distant rhythmic boom of artillery. The war was relentless, demanding sacrifices and compromises that transcended all previous boundaries. Ideology, for all its power, sometimes bent before the brute force of necessity. A temporary measure, he muttered to himself, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. A tool, nothing more. He would rationalize it, compartmentalize it. Samuel would be a medical instrument, devoid of racial identity, to be used, and then, when no longer needed, discarded. This dehumanizing language, Wirth knew, was the only way to reconcile the irreconcilable. It allowed him to maintain his ideological purity while simultaneously bending to the will of practical need. With a final decisive breath, Wirth returned to his desk. He picked up his pen, a heavy utilitarian SS-issued instrument, and scrawled a directive in his precise, disciplined hand. Dr. Maximilian Samuel, prisoner number 173, 398, was to be immediately reassigned. He would be transferred from his current labor detail to the camp hospital. Officially, his role would be to assist in treating the sick and dying prisoners, a convenient and outwardly acceptable cover story. This was plausible. Even in Auschwitz, a certain minimal level of medical care for prisoners was maintained to prevent outbreaks that could threaten the SS. But the implicit understanding, the unspoken truth that hung heavy in the frigid air of Wirth's office, was chillingly clear. Samuel's skills, his unparalleled expertise in advanced surgery, would not be confined to treating Jewish prisoners. They would be at the disposal of the SS, of the Wehrmacht, of any German deemed worthy of his life-saving touch. Wirth would ensure this was communicated to his trusted subordinates, quietly, off the record. The racial doctrine, the very foundation of the regime, was being openly circumvented, not out of mercy, but out of a desperate, cold pragmatism. A devil's bargain had been struck, a Faustian pact forged in the crucible of typhus and war. A man condemned to death by the very ideology he now served was about to be granted a temporary reprieve, not as an act of clemency, but as a calculated, cynical means to an end. Dr. Maximilian Samuel, the healer, was about to become an indispensable tool in the machinery of his own tormentors. The stage was set for a moral drama unlike any other, where the oath to save lives would collide head-on with the architects of genocide. February 1943. A cruel, penetrating cold still gripped Auschwitz, the kind that seemed to leach the warmth from bone and spirit alike. The camp's vast, bleak landscape remained under a persistent shroud of gray, the omnipresent smoke from the crematoria mingling with the frigid air. Inside the hospital barrack, now Maximilian Samuel's grim workplace, the atmosphere was a complex weave of fear, desperation, and a fragile, almost imperceptible thread of medical purpose. Since Wirth's pragmatic directive in December, Samuel had been performing surgeries primarily on prisoners, attempting to stem the tide of typhus and the horrific injuries sustained during forced labor. He moved through his days in a fog of exhaustion and a deep, simmering despair, his skilled hands working on bodies that were often beyond saving, a stark contrast to the gleaming operating theaters of Vienna. Each incision, each desperate attempt to heal, was a silent act of defiance against the camp's ultimate design of death. Then came the night that would shatter this fragile routine and forge an unprecedented path. A frantic alarm echoed through the barrack corridors, sharp and urgent. An Oberscharführer, a burly SS sergeant named Klaus, had been brought in. His face, usually flushed with authority, was pale and clammy, slick with sweat, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended rank. He had suffered a severe abdominal trauma after a mishap with heavy machinery near the camp's construction site. A winch cable had snapped, throwing a heavy metal beam that caught him squarely in the gut. Internal bleeding was suspected, possibly a perforated intestine, an emergency demanding immediate surgical intervention. Dr. Wirth, already on edge from a particularly frustrating day dealing with a fresh wave of typhus cases among his own men, rushed to the scene. He surveyed the Oberscharführer, whose groans of agony filled the small, sterile, deficient examination room. The situation was critical. Time was a luxury Klaus did not possess. Wirth barked orders, demanding the immediate presence of the camp's primary SS surgeon, Dr. Hoffmann. But Hoffmann was nowhere to be found. A junior medic, his face pale, stammered, "Herr Doctor, Hoffmann, he's unwell." The euphemism hung heavy in the air. Unwell meant drunk. Alcoholism was endemic among the SS doctors at Auschwitz, a common, self-prescribed balm for the atrocities they oversaw daily, a crude attempt to dull the unbearable edge of their monstrous existence. Hoffmann was likely comatose in his quarters, far beyond the reach of his professional duties. Wirth's jaw tightened, a vein throbbing visibly at his temple. Fury mixed with a chilling sense of exasperation. He could waste no more time. Klaus's life was ebbing away with every passing minute. There was only one option, one pair of hands in the entire camp capable of saving this man. A grim, almost imperceptible nod to an attending guard, and within moments, Samuel was summoned. He arrived, still wearing his blood-stained prisoner uniform, his face impassive, showing no hint of the shock or fear that might have gripped another man. He simply acknowledged the order with a slight dip of his head, his eyes, deep-set and weary, betraying nothing. The operating theater was a study in grim compromise. It was a barrack room, hastily converted, its walls rough-hewn planks that offered little insulation against the pervasive cold. A single bare light bulb, suspended from a frayed wire, cast harsh shadows that danced across the faces of the SS men and the desperate patient. The makeshift operating table, little more than a sturdy wooden bench covered with a thin, stained sheet, felt tragically flimsy. Samuel moved with an almost ritualistic grace, stripping off his prisoner jacket, preparing as best he could. The instruments, rudimentary and dulled, had been sterilized in a pot of boiling water, but their surfaces were pitted, carrying the silent threat of infection. Anesthesia was limited, a crude ether mask, administered by a nervous, inexperienced SS medic who barely concealed his disgust at taking orders from a Jew. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension, heavy with the weight of racial dogma bending under the iron fist of practical necessity. Samuel looked at the Oberscharführer, a man who, in any other circumstance, would have been his jailer, his tormentor. He saw the frantic rise and fall of the man's chest, the pallor of his skin, the almost frantic, shallow breaths. He did not see an SS uniform. He saw a human life hanging by a thread. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the intense focus that had always accompanied him into the operating theater. He pushed down the memories of his own family, of Hannah, Clara, Lena, likely murdered by this very regime. He pushed down the profound moral revulsion. All that existed in this moment was the anatomy before him, the urgent demand to save a life. Scalpel, he commanded in a low, steady voice, his Viennese accent still present, though dulled by years of disuse. The SS medic handed him the instrument, his hand trembling slightly. Samuel's fingers, despite their emaciation, closed around the cold steel with an instinctive familiarity. He paused for a fraction of a second, his gaze sweeping over the watchful, uncomfortable faces of Wirths, Schmidt, and the other SS doctors. He took a deep, centering breath. Then, with a practiced, decisive motion, he made the first incision. For 3 agonizing hours, Samuel operated. His movements were a testament to decades of rigorous training and innate genius. He navigated the ravaged abdominal cavity with meticulous care, his keen eyes instantly identifying the precise location of the perforation, the extent of the internal bleeding. He worked with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration, his every action precise and economical. The SS doctors watched, mesmerized despite themselves. Samuel's technique was unlike anything they had witnessed in their own rudimentary training. He employed a modified continuous suture, a technique he had refined under Sauerbruch, closing the wound with a speed and precision that left them momentarily stunned. He arrested the hemorrhage, repaired the perforation, and meticulously flushed the cavity, preventing further contamination. The raw skill on display was undeniable, almost frightening in its effortless mastery. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Samuel stepped back, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "He will live," he stated, his voice raspy but firm. "With careful post-operative care, he should make a full recovery." A collective, almost imperceptible sigh of relief swept through the room, quickly replaced by a renewed, awkward tension. Wirths, who had observed the entire procedure with unblinking intensity, simply nodded, a complex emotion flashing in his eyes, relief certainly, but also a deeper unease. He had given the order, and Samuel had delivered. The Oberscharführer's recovery was nothing short of remarkable. Within 3 weeks, against the odds of a camp hospital, he was out of bed, albeit weak and pale. His wounds healed cleanly without infection, a testament to Samuel's surgical skill in the face of inadequately sterilized instruments and primitive conditions. This success, this undeniable miracle of healing performed by a condemned Jew on an SS officer, created a dangerous and ironic precedent. Samuel became, in an instant, indispensable. He had proven his value in the most undeniable way possible, by saving a life that, according to Nazi ideology, was infinitely more valuable than his own. For Samuel, the act of saving Klaus's life was a profound, almost torturous moral dilemma. Each incision he made was a renewed act of his Hippocratic oath, a desperate attempt to cling to his humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Yet, each life he saved, especially a German life, potentially perpetuated the very regime that had annihilated his own family. His wife, Hannah, and his daughters, Clara and Lena, deported to Treblinka in July 1942, were ever-present ghosts. Their faces haunted his waking hours and stalked his fragmented dreams. "Every incision I made," he would later write in his fragmented memoirs, "was simultaneously an act of preserving my humanity and a betrayal to the millions being murdered. But if I refused to operate, would I not become exactly what they claimed we were? Less than human." This was the torment he carried, a silent, internal scream against the impossible choices he was forced to make. The warmth of the Oberscharführer's returning breath was a victory for medicine, but a bitter pill for his soul. This unprecedented event did not go unnoticed, nor was it easily digested by the SS officers in Auschwitz. Internal reports, often filled with chillingly bureaucratic language, began to circulate, detailing discussions about the Samuel problem. Some officers, pragmatic like Wirth's, argued that his expertise was too valuable to be wasted, that it should even warrant improved treatment for the prisoner. They saw the utility, the strategic advantage. But more rigid ideologues, especially those who had not witnessed Samuel's skill firsthand, were outraged. Allowing a Jew to operate on an Aryan, let alone an SS man, represented an intolerable racial contamination, a direct affront to Himmler's racial purity laws. It was a breach in the sacred firewall of their ideology. The resolution to this contradiction began to manifest through a peculiar psychological mechanism of dissociation. The SS, unable to reconcile Samuel's undeniable skill with his racial identity, began to mentally compartmentalize him. They stripped him of his name, his prisoner number, and even his Jewishness in their internal discourse. They began to refer to him simply as der Chirurg, the surgeon. Not the Jew surgeon, not prisoner Samuel, but the surgeon, as if the professional title could somehow detach him from the racial identity that otherwise condemned him. It was a linguistic sleight of hand, a desperate attempt to preserve their ideological coherence, to maintain the fiction of Aryan superiority, even as a subhuman, saved their lives. Samuel became less of a man and more of a function, an abstract tool. This cold, dehumanizing categorization, ironically, was the thin thread that kept him alive. He was too valuable to kill but too dangerous ideologically to recognize as a man. The stage for his continued torturous existence was firmly set. The chilling success of the Oberscharführer's operation in February 1943 had irrevocably altered Dr. Maximilian Samuel's fate within Auschwitz. The thin thread of Wirth's pragmatic decision had held and strengthened with each passing week. For the next 18 months, through the grinding monotony of 1943 and into the increasingly desperate year of 1944, Samuel's existence became a harrowing paradox, a prisoner condemned, yet protected, by the very regime that sought his annihilation. He was indispensable. His days settled into a brutal, relentless routine. Housed in a marginally cleaner section of the hospital barrack, his rations, while still meager, were just enough to sustain the rigorous demands placed upon him. Sleep was a restless, fitful escape, often interrupted by sudden summons for emergency surgery, or by haunting nightmares of Vienna, of Hannah's face, of Clara's laughter, now utterly unreachable. In those 18 months, Samuel performed at least 84 documented surgeries on German soldiers and SS officers. Each operation was meticulously recorded in the camp's chillingly bureaucratic ledgers by Dr. Wirth's, a testament to Samuel's relentless output and the growing reliance on his singular talent. Patients came from various sources: accidental injuries within the camp, illnesses among the SS staff, and increasingly, casualties from the ever-widening war fronts. As 1943 bled into 1944, the tide of the war turned decisively against the Third Reich. Initial triumphalism gave way to grim determination, then to a palpable undercurrent of desperation. News, filtered through whispers and the hushed conversations of his SS minders, spoke of devastating losses on the Eastern Front, of relentless Allied bombing campaigns in the West. With each strategic retreat, each pulverizing raid, the number of wounded Germans surged, overwhelming the already strained medical infrastructure across occupied Europe. Auschwitz, with its relatively sophisticated surgical facilities, found itself drawn further into the war effort, becoming a grim, reluctant extension of the Wehrmacht's field hospitals. Samuel's workload intensified exponentially. The operations grew more complex, more urgent. He performed amputations on soldiers whose limbs were mangled by shrapnel, intricate repairs on blast-damaged organs, and delicate neurosurgeries on head trauma victims. The SS doctors assigned to assist him, Schmidt, Schneider, Richter, continued to observe with that same unsettling blend of grudging respect and ideological revulsion. They could not deny his skill, even as it chipped away at the bedrock of their racist doctrines. They still referred to him as der Chirurg, a chillingly efficient way to compartmentalize him, to detach his professional identity from his racial one, maintaining their internal coherence while benefiting from his expertise. It was a silent, unwritten rule. He was the surgeon, not the Jew. For Samuel, each surgery was a renewed battle, not just for the patient's life, but for his own soul. He wrestled with an agonizing moral dilemma. He, a Jew, a prisoner whose family had been murdered by this very regime, was saving the lives of its agents, its soldiers. The Hippocratic oath, sworn decades ago in Vienna, echoed constantly. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. His professional integrity demanded he save lives, but his personal suffering, his grief, screamed for defiance, for refusal. He rationalized it as an act of resistance, a refusal to let the Nazis turn him into a monster. If I allowed myself to be governed by hate, he often thought, then they would have truly won. It was a solitary, profound struggle, fought with scalpel and suture, under the baleful gaze of his captors. The summer of 1944 brought a cataclysmic shift in the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive, annihilated Germany's Army Group Center, driving a wedge deep into occupied territory. The casualties were staggering, an unprecedented torrent of wounded pouring westward, overwhelming every available hospital. Simultaneously in August, the Warsaw Uprising erupted, a desperate, valiant, but ultimately doomed attempt by the Polish resistance to liberate their capital. The brutal German suppression of the uprising generated another massive wave of horrific casualties, both German and Polish, pushing the medical system to its absolute breaking point. Auschwitz, strategically located and equipped with its surgical block, became a receiving station for the overflowing tide of broken bodies. The camp hospital was transformed into a desperate, chaotic triage center. The smell of blood and antiseptic became overpowering, mixed with the sweat of overworked medics and the raw stench of fear. For Samuel, it was a blur of ceaseless activity, a waking nightmare that tested the very limits of his endurance. In one particularly harrowing 72-hour period following the Warsaw Uprising, Samuel performed 13 surgeries. It was a marathon of life and death, conducted under the most abysmal conditions. He moved from one operating table to another, his hands a blur of purposeful motion. 3 amputations, limbs mangled beyond repair, requiring swift, decisive action. 2 craniotomies, complex, delicate brain surgeries, demanding absolute precision to remove shrapnel or relieve pressure from swelling. Procedures extremely difficult even in state-of-the-art hospitals, let alone with rudimentary equipment and flickering lights. He worked through the nights, fueled by stale coffee and sheer willpower, his body screaming for rest, his mind a steel trap of surgical focus. The SS doctors assisting him were visibly exhausted, their faces pale, their movements sluggish. They watched Samuel, a man literally being starved, perform with an unwavering intensity that shamed them. They were forced to recognize, even if only in the privacy of their own thoughts, that his abilities dramatically exceeded their own. The ideological facade was cracking, albeit slowly, under the relentless pressure of irrefutable life-saving skill. Then in October 1944, a moment of profound, almost surreal historical irony unfolded. Dr. Josef Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, whose very name evoked terror and grotesque experimentation, appeared at the hospital. Mengele, usually clad in his pristine SS uniform, his polished boots clicking ominously, was the architect of unspeakable medical atrocities. He rarely acknowledged the camp's ordinary medical staff, let alone its prisoners, unless for his macabre research. He approached Samuel, who was just finishing a complex abdominal repair on a wounded SS grenadier. Mengele's expression was a mixture of scientific curiosity and thinly veiled disdain. "Dr. Samuel," Mengele began, his voice surprisingly smooth but authoritative, "I require your consultation." Samuel, despite the shock, maintained his impassive demeanor, simply nodding. "I am planning an intricate surgical procedure," Mengele continued, his eyes glinting with a cold, intellectual zeal, "on one of my subjects, a particularly interesting case involving congenital cardiac anomalies. Your published works on advanced thoracic techniques have come to my attention. I require your professional opinion on the feasibility of a certain intervention." He did not say prisoner, but subject, and Samuel instantly understood. One of Mengele's experimental victims. A cold dread coiled in Samuel's stomach. To participate was an act of profound complicity, a violation of everything he stood for. To refuse Mengele was an act of suicidal defiance. The Angel of Death had the power to send him to the gas chambers with a mere flick of his wrist. Samuel met Mengele's gaze, his own eyes holding a quiet, unwavering resolve. "Herr Doctor," Samuel replied, his voice steady, polite but firm, "I regret to inform you that my oath as a physician prevents me from offering any counsel or participation in procedures that do not have the sole purpose of healing or alleviating suffering. My skills are for the preservation of life, not for experimentation." The words hung in the air, a breathtaking act of moral courage. Mengele's face, for a fleeting moment, betrayed a flicker of surprise. Then a distinct flush crept up his neck, a subtle sign of embarrassment. To be refused by a prisoner, a Jew, in front of his own subordinate SS doctors, was an intolerable humiliation. He had been forced to acknowledge, in that stark moment, the superior expertise of the man he considered racially inferior, only to be rebuffed on moral grounds. Without another word, his back rigid with simmering fury and wounded pride, Mengele simply turned and strode out of the barrack, his polished boots clicking a sharp rhythm of retreat. The SS doctors present exchanged nervous glances, a silent acknowledgement of the extraordinary scene they had just witnessed. Samuel, the condemned prisoner, had stood his ground against the notorious Angel of Death and, impossibly, survived. This incident illustrated a profound truth. In certain rare, desperate moments, the sheer, undeniable hierarchy of specialized knowledge could temporarily subvert even the most rigid, murderous racial hierarchies of the Nazi regime. Samuel's expertise, combined with his quiet, unyielding moral compass, had carved out a fragile, precarious space for him, making him a ghost in the machinery of death, a healer in the heart of hell. His value now extended beyond mere utility. It held a strange, unspoken power, a silent challenge to the very logic of Auschwitz. The cold grip of winter had intensified in January 1945, mirroring the tightening vice around the Third Reich. The distant thunder of Soviet artillery, once a faint, unsettling hum on the horizon, had become a relentless, earth-shaking rumble. Its vibrations pulsed through the frozen ground of Auschwitz, a terrifying prelude to the approaching Red Army. Panic rippled through the SS ranks, thinly veiled by forced displays of discipline. Orders for evacuation became frantic, haphazard. Trains, already choked with retreating soldiers and civilians, were suddenly tasked with transporting thousands of prisoners westward, away from the advancing Soviets. A final, brutal act of extermination disguised as relocation, the infamous death marches. In the midst of this escalating chaos, Dr. Eduard Wirtz, the SS chief physician, faced his ultimate personal and professional reckoning. The shadow of defeat loomed, and Wirth, ever the pragmatist, began to calculate not for the glory of the Reich, but for his own survival. He knew the war was lost. He also knew that his role at Auschwitz, regardless of the scientific pretexts, would condemn him. As the camp prepared for its final horrific liquidation, Wirth made a decision that, yet again, defied Nazi doctrine, but served his self-preservation. He would allow Dr. Maximilian Samuel to remain. Wirth summoned Samuel to his office, a room now stripped of many of its Aryanized furnishings, papers scattered in disarray. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of fear and stale cigarette smoke. Wirth, his face drawn, met Samuel's impassive gaze. "Dr. Samuel," he began, his voice devoid of its usual authority, tinged with a strange urgency. "The camp is being evacuated. All prisoners are to be moved west." Samuel simply nodded, expecting the inevitable, the final walk into the frozen wastes where his life would surely end. "However," Wirth continued, his eyes darting around the room, "there are German wounded, too many to evacuate. They require constant expert care. I am authorizing you to remain, to tend to them." He did not meet Samuel's eyes directly. The words were a bitter pill for Wirth, a forced concession to a man he considered subhuman, yet a necessary gambit. He understood that Samuel's existence, his invaluable service, could potentially be used as a shield, a token of clemency, should he ever face Allied tribunals. It was a cynical act of calculated self-interest, but for Samuel, it was an unimaginable reprieve from the impending death march, a deferral of the certain end. He was to be a living, breathing exhibit of Wirth's supposed humanity. Samuel, numb with fatigue and years of sustained trauma, could only nod again. The irony was not lost on him. He had been kept alive to save the lives of his tormentors, and now he was being kept alive by his tormentor, to save more of them, even as his own people were being marched to their deaths. He felt no gratitude, only a profound, weary acceptance of this final, grotesque twist of fate. The ensuing days were a maelstrom of chaos and despair. As the SS began their hasty retreat, they left behind a horrific tableau: thousands of sick, starving, and incapacitated prisoners, too weak to join the forced marches, abandoned in the barracks. These were the true condemned, left to die of exposure, starvation, or a bullet from a stray SS guard. The distant artillery intensified, a relentless drumbeat against the impending dawn of liberation. Samuel, given grudging authority by Wirth's last-minute directive, found himself almost alone in the vast, desolate hospital complex. The German wounded were few now, most having been evacuated in earlier, more organized transports. His focus shifted, instinctively, profoundly. He moved from barrack to barrack, a solitary figure in the decaying heart of the camp, ignoring the official order, drawn instead by the plaintive cries of his fellow prisoners. He was no longer treating the SS, he was treating the abandoned. His Hippocratic oath, unbroken even through years of unimaginable horror, now found its true, desperate purpose. He worked without pause, fueled by sheer willpower and a desperate primal urge to heal. He dressed festering wounds, spoon-fed water to the delirious, administered what little pain medication remained, comforted the dying. He was a lone sentinel against the encroaching tide of death, a beacon of humanity and the ultimate monument to inhumanity. The faces he tended were those of his own people, shattered and emaciated, clinging to the last vestiges of life. Each breath he helped sustain, each moment of comfort he provided, was a small, profound victory against the colossal machinery of annihilation. He did not know if the Soviets would arrive in time, or if he too would be summarily executed, but in those final terrible days he was simply the doctor, healing the broken. Then, on January 27, 1945, the earth shook. The roar of tanks, the guttural shouts of men speaking an unfamiliar tongue, the shattering of the main gate. Red Army soldiers, their faces grim and weary, poured into Auschwitz. They moved with cautious urgency, navigating the bewildering landscape of watchtowers, barbed wire, and silent, eerie barracks. The air was thick with the smell of death, a chilling testament to the atrocities they had only just begun to comprehend. When they entered the hospital barrack, they stopped dead. The scene was surreal. Amidst the squalor, the blood, and the omnipresent scent of suffering, Dr. Maximilian Samuel stood at an operating table, his gaunt frame hunched, his hands still working, meticulously dressing a gangrenous wound on a young Polish prisoner. Around him, on makeshift beds and on the floor, lay dozens of patients, prisoners he had kept alive against impossible odds. He looked up. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed by years of trauma, met the startled gazes of the Soviet soldiers. Exhaustion was etched into every line of his face, but there was also a profound, unwavering dignity. He was still working, still saving lives, even as the gates of hell burst open. He was not a broken man, but a man profoundly, impossibly human. The consequences of Samuel's story echoed far beyond his own remarkable survival. In the immediate aftermath of the war, his existence and the unique role he played became crucial, complex evidence in the post-war trials. Between 1946 and 1949, Samuel testified in 4 separate proceedings, including the trial of Dr. Edward Wirths. His accounts were detailed, factual, and delivered with a remarkable absence of vindictiveness. He described actions, the specific procedures, the names of the patients he saved, the primitive conditions. He did not judge motivations, leaving that chilling task to the courts, but his calm, unwavering testimony painted a damning portrait of a system that bent its own monstrous rules when faced with practical necessity. Several SS medical officers, including Wirths himself, attempted to use Samuel's preservation as evidence of their own clemency, their supposed humanity amidst the atrocities. "We saved a Jew, a highly skilled surgeon," they argued, their voices tinged with a desperate self-justification. "We went against Himmler's directives to keep him alive." They presented Samuel's survival as proof of their benevolence, their moral superiority. But their defense was unequivocally rejected by the tribunals. The court saw through the transparent veneer of their arguments, recognizing that Samuel's life was spared not out of mercy, but out of cynical pragmatism, a calculated utility that only underscored the profound moral bankruptcy of their ideology. Their attempts at self-exoneration merely highlighted their continued incomprehension of the true nature of their crimes. Samuel, having faced the architects of his suffering in court, turned his back on the horrors of Europe. In 1949, he emigrated to Israel, a land striving for new beginnings. There, he quietly rebuilt his life, returning to his true calling. He worked as a surgeon for another 30 years, his hands, though older and perhaps less steady, still performing miracles of healing, now on patients who embraced him. He rarely spoke publicly about Auschwitz, the memories too raw, too deeply embedded in his soul. But he left behind detailed, fragmented memoirs, a testament to his extraordinary journey, published posthumously. In those pages, he articulated the profound, unsettling lesson of his survival. "They believed they made me less than human, but every life I saved, German, Polish, Jewish, proved that humanity cannot be destroyed by ideology, only temporarily obscured." His story, and those of other skilled professionals who faced similar impossible dilemmas, revealed dimensions of the Holocaust often obscured by simpler narratives of pure victimization or unadulterated heroism. It demonstrated how totalitarian systems, built on irrational ideologies, inevitably create insoluble practical contradictions. And it showed how individuals caught within these systems navigated choices where no morally pure options existed. Samuel's legacy remains a disturbing, vital reminder that history's greatest atrocities emerge not when human beings become monsters, but when systems of thought allow monsters to see themselves as rational, when pragmatic necessity twists morality into an unrecognizable shape, and when the light of humanity is dimmed, but never extinguished. And so, the snow that fell so heavily on January 18, 1945 at Auschwitz, witnessed not just the final frantic hours of a dying regime, but the unwavering resilience of a single human spirit. Dr. Maximilian Samuel, the healer in hell, found himself in a paradox within a paradox, saved from the death marches by a cynical calculation, only to remain and tend to the abandoned, his final act of defiance a desperate embrace of his Hippocratic oath. He was found by the Red Army, still working, surrounded by the lives he had miraculously preserved. His hands, which had once cradled delicate organs in Vienna's finest operating theaters, and later stitched SS officers under threat of death, were now dedicated entirely to the dying, forgotten souls of the camp, a testament to an indomitable humanity. Samuel's survival was not merely an individual triumph, but a chilling mirror reflecting the profound moral bankruptcy of an ideology that devoured its own logic. His voice, calm and factual, echoed in post-war tribunals, a dispassionate account that stripped away the pretense of SS clemency and exposed the raw, ugly truth of practical necessity overriding dogma. He was a living paradox, whose mere existence unmasked the inherent contradictions of a system built on irrational hatred. He healed, not out of love for his captors, but out of an unyielding commitment to his identity as a doctor, as a man, refusing to let the machinery of death claim his soul. He continued to save lives for decades after, his legacy not of vengeance but of enduring human purpose. His memoirs whisper across time, reminding us that evil, however pervasive, cannot utterly extinguish the light within. It can only obscure it temporarily, like a shadow passing over the sun. This harrowing saga of skill, survival, and profound moral choice forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that the greatest atrocities often unfold not when humanity entirely vanishes, but when logic is contorted, when necessity becomes a cruel master, and when individuals choose to be rational within an insane system. What do you think of Dr. Samuel's impossible choices? Could you have maintained your humanity in the face of such relentless evil? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If the untold stories of unwavering courage and the complex moral landscapes of World War II intrigue you, watch our video on the silent heroes of the ghettos next. And if you're moved by these forgotten tales, please give this video a like and subscribe to WW2 Lost Stories for more journeys into the depths of history.